This is Season 2, Episode 3 of From Guns to Keyboards. We're back after a small hiatus. Michael and I have pretty much gotten back to a normal routine of life. Michael, you just started a new job. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And I just went back to my old job from Miloim, from reserve duty back to work. So life is settling in for both of us. It's been a bit hectic as we get settled. But now we're back, and we're hoping to be delivering more podcast episodes on a more frequent basis. In the meantime, since I think we last spoke, a lot has happened. So, first of all, we have the ceasefire in Lebanon, which, from what we can tell, is mostly holding. Moving on to that, Syria, probably one of the biggest stories, the fall of the Assad regime, the taking of the country by this coalition of rebel groups who have since begun creating their own government, with Israel then moving in to southern Syria and the northern Mount Hebron. In the meantime, you have this kind of small-scale fighting going on still in Gaza. Most of Gaza at this point, from all reports, is basically in ruins. Hamas is very much unable to do much more than squad-sized attacks against IDF forces. But it's very much turned into a military occupation rather than a large-scale maneuver warfare type situation. The West Bank, we're suddenly seeing the PA try to become a real serious security force, as PA soldiers are moving into refugee camps in places like Jenin, doing arrests, roundups, gunfights with various, I guess you can call them Palestinian militias. They are currently asking the United States for the proper weapons and gear and training, honestly, that they would need to carry out these operations. Israel, from what I can tell, is debating on whether or not they're going to allow that U.S. equipment to reach them. That's in regards to that. In the meantime, for domestic issues, what is it? Bibi's got his trial going on still. Actually, right by my house. It's where the courthouse is in Tel Aviv. It's in Tel Aviv just due to the fact that the one in Jerusalem didn't have kind of an underground basement, and for security purposes, Bibi wants there to be an underground basement. Understandable. There's that. There is renewed talk of the judicial reform, the one that sparked the various protests all across the country back a lifetime ago in 2023. In addition, we have the theaters of warfare have kind of shifted at this point. We've been subject to several missile strikes, successful missile strikes, from the Houthis in Yemen, with return strikes from the Israeli Air Force, but all reports indicate that that has not been the focus of Israeli intelligence for decades. So where and who these people are is still a bit of a mystery to the Israelis. There's plenty of talk of a renewed strike on Iran in Iranian nuclear facilities now that Syrian air defenses have been taken out and Iranian air defenses have been taken out, that now is the time for the Israelis to actually strike with against the Iranians. At the same time, we're seeing this weird kind of mix of two presidents. The current sitting president, President Joe Biden, and the incoming president, President Donald Trump. Both their teams are taking a very active approach to the goings-on in the Middle East, in particular to the hostage deal, which is currently taking place in Cairo and in Qatar. Both Trump's team and Biden's team are involved, along with high-level Israeli officials as well. Whether or not that will evolve into an actual deal remains a mystery. The biggest sticking point, I think, for the Israelis is that they don't want the war to end. Where after all the hostages are released, Bibi just did an interview with the Wall Street Journal, saying as much. And so it's unclear if he's trying to stop the hostage deal again, or for the Israelis, that is just a true red line. That's a lot, right? I think that's pretty much it.
I think just in your roundup, we realized that every time we have a pause in between recording episodes, the entire world changes.
Everything.
And then we come back to record another one.
Yeah, that roundup I think we covered 10 stories in about 5 minutes, so that was a big one. But yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot has happened. Lots moving.
For those who missed what Dillon said, I'll sum up in a sentence. The entire Middle East has undergone a major revolution in the past 2 weeks, and now welcome back to the new war. And that's I said that kind of jokingly, but that's really the feeling. A lot of people referred to Israel's war as being a seven-front war, 4 fronts being very much on Israel's borders with Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria, 4 of the 7 fronts, and another 3 fronts taking place further from Israel's borders. You have Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. And all 7 of these fronts played out in this constellation of war one way or another since October 7th of 2023. Now, as you perfectly described, we're seeing this completely new war taking place in the Middle East, where 5 of the 7 theaters of war are becoming gradually irrelevant, whether it's full-on theaters that have just gone to sleep, like Lebanon with the ceasefire, or Syria with the revolution, or Abbas retaking control over much of the West Bank and reasserting his authority there, or areas that there's currently ceasefire negotiations in, like Gaza, like Hamas in Gaza. There's also the story of militias in Iraq that have largely decided to stop firing at Israel. These 5 theaters are what I call part of the old war. These were some of the hottest theaters of the old war that we saw from October 7th until, I would say, a couple weeks ago. And now we're seeing this transformation happening where these 2 further theaters from Israel, Yemen and Iran, are really taking a lot more of a significant shift here, or a lot more of a significant role here. The Yemenites, with Iranian guidance, not with Iranian guidance, not entirely clear, are, as you mentioned, shooting a lot more at Israel. I do really think that this is the start of a new war. That is at least the way I look at it. I think that the Israelis are going to have some sort of fundamental shift in its strategy to deal with a threat so far from its borders, and think about who it's going to strike back at, how it's going to strike back, and how it needs to prepare in the long run for this type of theater of battle. I think we discussed this in previous episodes, that Israel is not really set up for these long-range engagements with enemies. It's set up very much for carrying out ground maneuvers in its immediate vicinity. So I think that the beginning of the new war, with Yemen kind of taking on the mantle of the fighting from the remaining theaters of war, I believe is going to have very significant repercussions, at least for the next 3 to 4 months, and maybe even going forward from that. Iran also, it would be unfair to say that Iran is heating back up, because they, in some constellation or another, have been very much responsible for overseeing all of the different proxies of these many different 7 theaters of war that have been fighting against Israel. That being said, I think that the level of direct fighting that we're expecting to see with Iran in the coming weeks, with Trump coming back to power, with the Iranians weaker now than they've ever been, with the military opportunity for Israel stronger than it's ever been, and with the motivation stronger than it's ever been on the Israeli side, owing to the ongoing attacks from its proxy, the Houthis in Yemen, it seems as if the prospect of an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities or on significant energy infrastructure in Iran, if this was once a doomsday prospect that few like to talk about, now this is something that's very much on the table. This is the main aspect of the new war that we're going to have to see how it plays out in the coming weeks.
Yeah, well, I think, to kind of go back, I think you kind of nailed a couple points. So when you ask the question of how does Israel fight these long-range wars, I think we'd have to, Israel has basically 2 options. Option 1 is the proxy battle, which is what the Iranians are currently doing, and that's how most nations fight large-scale wars. I always ask the question, what's the difference between the U.S. military versus every other military in the world? And the difference is that the U.S. is a logistical juggernaut. They can put entire divisions on the ground anywhere in the world with logistical supply chains to supply them within 72 hours. That's what separates the United States from every other nation in the world. Every other nation in the world, for the most part, is relying on proxies or mercenaries. But for the most part, proxies tend to be the situation. We see that particularly in the Middle East, where you see goals aligned between 2 different groups, usually a stronger one. We'll use the Iranians, for example, and the Houthis. The Houthis want to control Yemen, and the Iranians want influence throughout the Middle East. Israel has used proxies in the past. However, proxies have a way of backfiring, particularly on the Israelis, because oftentimes the goals just don't really align. And I think one of the best examples is the first Lebanon war and the Maronite Christians, which Israel saw as a natural ally against the Shia and Sunni Muslims who were supporting the PLO in southern Lebanon. You know, the PLO were harassing these Maronite Christians. When I say harassing, it's maybe kind of a gentle word, massacring Maronite Christians and causing a civil war in southern Lebanon, a brutal civil war. And the Israelis went to the Maronite Christians and said, let us help you against these PLO, these foreign Muslims in your country who are killing your people. Let us help you against them. The problem was the Maronite Christians interpreted that as, oh, great, the IDF's going to do the fighting for us. We'll just kind of point them in the right direction, and there they go. Whereas the IDF assumed, okay, we'll just kind of give the Maronite Christians weapons, and they'll do the fighting. So the goals there didn't really align, and as a result, we saw a total collapse of southern Lebanon and the undisputed rise of Hezbollah there. These proxy battles just haven't really worked out in Israel's favor so much in the past. So what Israel's kind of done, I think, since the first Lebanon war is really invest in its Air Force and the ability of its bombing ability throughout the world. Israel does have the capability, unlike maybe with the exception of Turkey, to bomb within a large vicinity. It can go to Yemen and do direct strikes there, which it has done previous times. It can go to Iran. It has absolute air superiority over both regions. And this is how Israel tends to fight. Now, will Iran start using proxy forces as it sort of looks to dig into a larger battle against the Houthis, maybe, and the Iranians? Look, Iran is kind of the perfect place to have proxy battles because Iran is a mishmash and smorgasbord of various ethnic groups who don't really trust each other that much and who have a long history of violence against each other. It's quite easy to pick an ethnic group and say, hey, look at the way that the Shia government is mistreating you guys. Wouldn't you love it if, you guys took these guns we're going to give you and did X, Y, and Z? For sure, I'm sure that Israel has assassinated many nuclear scientists using just that strategy in Iran. The issue is, can these people be a long-term reliable ally, or are they going to go the way that the Maronite Christians did during the first Lebanese war?
Yeah. Or I'll even ask a follow-up question to you on that one, which is, let's say that they're not a reliable ally. Let's say that the best we can get is a short-term contractor, we'll call it, to collaborate with Israel, be it in Iran or be it in other theaters of battle, on a very specific task. Is it worth it for us, the Israelis, to enter into a series of short-term relationships that may pay out over a more limited time that we'd want? Or are we better off not even touching that possibility?
I think when you look at just short-term situations, you run the risk of just developing a reputation as an unreliable partner. If let's say you go to the Kurds, right, and you say to the Kurds, hey, we're going to help you, take back some of the land in Syria that was taken from you. And so what? So the minute that they kick out some Iranian proxy group, you say, okay, bye, and you leave. Well, now you left these guys high and dry. And at the end of the day, if they don't have your help or your logistical support anymore, there's a good chance they're going to be overrun. So what have you really accomplished in that sense? But I want to answer your question with another question as well, which is, are you referring to the idea, which has been floating around in Israel for quite a bit, of hiring mercenary groups to manage Gaza after the war?
So I was not referring to that, but I love this topic, so I think we should just get right into it.
Should we get it? Oh, God. Okay, let's do it. So you love this topic.
I love this topic because I think that, this is a classic example of kind of the question that I was asking you, which is, are Band-Aids, I use Band-Aids as a code word for short-term solutions to solve some sort of pressing problem, are Band-Aids an acceptable foreign policy tool if the Band-Aid comes in the form, in this case, of a capitalist, likely Western mercenary taking responsibility over aid distribution in Gaza? Now, just to kind of recap this issue for our listeners who aren't familiar with what Dillon and I are talking about, basically Israel is permitting, to some degree or another, it varies by day, international humanitarian agencies to bring aid into the Gaza Strip, and from there to, in one way or another, distribute that aid between the residents of Gaza that obviously have various challenges in finding stable supplies of food and water and what have you.
Basically, Israel's biggest concern is that this aid will find its way into Hamas's hands, and Israel doesn't want to be the army that's essentially funding and paying for its enemy to keep fighting.
Exactly. So Israel has this weird balancing act that it's playing, where on the one hand, it does have an interest in bringing aid into Gaza in order to satisfy its international partners that want to see a stable humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. On the other hand, it is not interested in seeing this aid fall into the hands of Hamas, which Hamas uses to basically make money and basically resell on the Gaza market. You have basic food staples in Gaza, which would typically, as in most countries, cost very little money, costing now hundreds of dollars for very basic items because of scarcity of specific staples.
You didn't necessarily resell it, as long as people believe the food is coming from Hamas and that international aid organizations, Hamas is able to maintain a level of power and control over the population.
Precisely, yes. Now, Israel has a couple of solutions for dealing with this problem. Solution one is finding a long-term political solution for Gaza that replaces Hamas and allows for humanitarian aid to stably go into the Strip, which is important to mention, by the way. One thing that Dylan and I didn't discuss on this topic is that it's not only Hamas looting these aid trucks. A lot of the times you have different criminal gangs, you have different Gazan clans sending their people, raiding these trucks and taking them over. So this looting problem of aid not making its way to the right people is even wider than Hamas, which is why solution one is one of the potential solutions here, basically having some sort of internationally backed political alternative to Hamas that will allow for the distribution of aid in Gaza. Currently not on the table from the Israeli government's perspective, and by the way, even if it was, I highly doubt that Israel has the political and diplomatic bandwidth, even with the support of the Americans, to bring about that sort of change. The PA isn't interested. All of its partners are interested.
I disagree when you say the PA is not interested. I disagree with you before, and I disagree with you again. I think the PA is trying to show both the world and the Israelis that they're ready to take on Gaza by basically exercising military control within their own borders.
It's possible. You might be right. I read what the PA is doing in the West Bank as just fight or flight response to what's happening in Syria, where it saw Assad fall at the hands of a bunch of jihadists or former jihadists, everybody with their own understanding of who these groups are. And I think that Abbas freaked out and realized that he's next if he doesn't take on Hamas and all of its affiliates in the West Bank.
Well, also there's videos that have been circulating, particularly within Palestinian circles, various Palestinian militants pledging themselves to Iran and forming a unit called, I believe, Unit 313, which is the number 313 is very significant within Shia Islam. I think it represents the 313 that were massacred in the Battle of Karbala, but don't quote me on that.
Interesting.
Yeah, so these videos, I mean, you see them. These are militia Palestinians living in the West Bank, fully armed, pledging themselves to the Iranians, to the Ayatollah. And I think from PA's perspective, they're seeing this as, look, the Iranians, clearly they support Hamas over the PA. And not only that, but just from a cultural perspective, I mean, if you're a Sunni Muslim leader and you see your people slowly being taken in by Shia Islam, it's not great for you. That's sort of like a parent of the greatest generation watching his daughter become a flower child on the streets on Haight Street in San Francisco. It's not great to see. You don't want someone taking such a radical turn in their life and in their ideology.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that may undermine the situation in the West Bank.
That being said, to bring it back, though, I do believe that the PA, they have expressed interest in the past. I don't put the blame on the PA, honestly. I put the blame on Israel. I put the blame on the Israeli coalition, for whom having Palestinians rule in Gaza is not something that they want, and it's not something that their constituents are interested in. It's very clear that the far right in the Israeli coalition is far more interested in settling Gaza. You've had far right ministers attending conferences in Sderot and other places along called the Gaza envelope, Otef Gaza, where they speak about how they're going to repopulate and resettle Gaza with these various settlements. They're not hiding it. It's very clear what they want. So why would they be interested in the PA coming in? The PA, in the meanwhile, I think is just trying to show to the Americans, especially to Trump, who has made it very clear, he wants this war over by the time he takes office. The PA is trying to flex its military muscle to say, hey, the thing you guys wanted us to do, which is take control of our own borders, we're doing it. We can do this. We are a military force, and we will exercise that might. So we can do that here. We can potentially do that in Gaza as well. I blame the Israelis for not letting it happen.
Yeah. Look, there's no doubt that, I said this also earlier, that the Israelis are not interested in this solution. I think you're right. It's just a question of whether or not it's exclusively the Israelis. I would say it's a mix. I think the Israelis aren't interested in bringing the PA back to Gaza for the reason you just mentioned. At least not this specific governing coalition is interested. And I would add to that it seems that at least for now, that the PA is kind of in, the way I look at it at least, something of a comfortable situation where it can, claim that it is the sole political representatives of the Palestinian people, but at the same time, does it really want the headache of being the governors of Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah? I'm not so sure, but we can.
Look, there's no doubt that the PA had a year and a half, if not before October 7th, to crack down on these militia groups that were very much growing within its own borders. It shows now, which, as you mentioned, after the fall of Assad's regime, at a time where you're seeing Hamas and Iranian influence in the West Bank suddenly explode. I think you're right. I think to the extent that Abbas is definitely concerned about his grip on power within the West Bank. That being said, I do know that historically the PA has expressed interest. If I want to take a generous approach to the Israelis, I can understand, even from like a moderate perspective, like forget the far right for a second, just from a moderate perspective of like, well, you guys can't even govern your own borders, so how in the world are you supposed to govern Gaza when the Gazans hate you? I can see that aspect. But let's kind of bring it back to the solution the solution number 2 that has been talked about, which is the introduction of mercenaries into Gaza.
Which, by the way, it's important to mention before we get into that there is an alternative approach here. We can call it Solution 3, which is allow no aid to get into Gaza, right? That is an approach that's on the table, where Israel goes through this very cold Machiavellian understanding of the war, where it says we're not going to allow any aid to get into the Gaza Strip so long as there are hostages and Hamas in power in Gaza. That is an option to solve Hamas using the aid for its own needs, its own financial needs, to continue to fund the war and to continue to stay in power. I personally don't support such a solution, and I don't think that Israel has the political bandwidth to bring about such a solution, even if it wanted to commit to such a path. So I don't view it as entirely relevant, at least for now. So we can kind of put that, at least because of the diplomatic repercussions of such a solution, we can put that to the side for now. And solution number 1 of bringing the PA or some sort of alternate group into Gaza, we can discuss how much it's probable, how much it's improbable, who wants it, who doesn't want it. For now, it's not happening. And then you have this track 2 that you were discussing right now, which is bringing in mercenaries into Gaza, which, the concept behind the solution is basically to pay off former special forces from Britain, the States, or
like a Blackwater type group.
Right, a Blackwater type group that would be responsible for 2 main missions. Mission 1 is driving and securing trucks that are bringing aid in through crossings controlled by Israel into the Gaza Strip. and making sure they're not looted on their path. And two, once they get to distribution points, to basically guard the distribution points and ensure that the aid is getting to the right people and the distribution points are not being looted by Hamas or other armed groups. Those would be the two tasks delegated to these mercenaries. I would argue, and this is why I love talking about this topic, that while it's not, shall we say, the most politically correct thing to say, to believe in using mercenaries in a theater of battle, and it doesn't always look best on paper, and the history of using mercenaries in war, as America learned in Iraq, is not always a positive one. With the choices that Israel is facing right now, this is really the only option that it has in bringing aid into Gaza, and it might have negative repercussions, including fighting with the Palestinian people, or some sort of hostility between these groups and the Palestinian people in Gaza. That is some sort of negative repercussion that we have to be aware of. But again, I want to tie this back to what you and I were discussing earlier about proxies and the new war that Israel is facing, or that Israel is fighting right now. Israel has to make the call as to whether or not it wants to use these quote-unquote proxies, these quote-unquote allies that it's funding and empowering to carry out its needs. It has to make a call as to whether or not these are the stakeholders that we want to back, or whether or not we have an interest in going behind some other solution. Could it be that after 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, this entire framework will fall apart, and Israel, after bringing in these mercenaries to Gaza, will ultimately see that it's turned into this behemoth of corruption and spending on foreign ex-special forces that's not going anywhere? It's all possible. But the question that I want to push here, and this I would love to hear your opinion on, is whether or not it's the best solution that we got. And I would say my argument here is that while it's not a good solution, and it's far from an ideal solution, it's the best one we got right now. And if we are serious about destroying Hamas in a practical way and getting aid to the mouths of Gazans who really do deserve that aid, this might be the only thing that we have left.
Let me ask you this question. Why mercenaries? Why not IDF soldiers?
Again, I think it's the question of practical and probable solutions. Israel's not interested in taking on this task. And even
why not?
Again, maybe from a moral perspective, we could have that conversation of,
not even from a moral, from a strategic perspective. You and I have been big advocates of a counterinsurgency operation in the Gaza Strip. So why now, when we see Israel taking a step and being like, okay, let's secure aid to the civilian population, keep it out of the hands of the enemies, the Israelis are saying, we agree with that in theory, but we ourselves are not willing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from the Israeli perspective, the prospect of being the ones responsible for putting your lives on the line to secure aid to the Palestinian people, the same group of people that invaded you and raped your women and looted your villages and burned your homes on October 7th, the prospect of being responsible for risking your lives to provide them with aid, I don't think Israelis would get behind. And honestly, you do have to think about in my opinion, the morale of troops when it comes to the types of tasks that we hand out to troops on the battlefield. And I don't see Israel as an independent unit taking on this task in a stable long-term way, meaning that I think that if IDF soldiers got this task of being responsible for handing out aid to Palestinians, I think that all it will take is one incident to happen with the Palestinian population, one soldier getting killed in some sort of distribution operation. I think the entire thing will fall apart, and I don't see this as a long-term stable solution. On the other hand, you take in mercenaries, where I'm sure that there will be incidents. I'm sure that there will be fighting between the mercenaries and the Palestinians. But these are organizations that, by their very design and nature, are for-profit, capitalist, money-making organizations that build into their cost structures the cost of war, which for them is the cost of doing business, and understand that part of the job that they took on, part of the contract that they're taking on, is losing some of their personnel in the field of battle. And I think the personnel going into this are also aware of that. So again, does Israel maybe have a strategic interest in bringing its soldiers into distributing the aid and taking the aid out of Hamas's hands? Yes, I think you're right. I genuinely think you're right. I just don't think that it's a practical solution that Israel can ensure for the long term. And we have to try to choose some sort of solution here, even if it's a band-aid, even if it's a medium-term solution that will only work for 3 months. We have to choose the solution that we think does have some sort of chance of making it for some definite period of time. I don't see IDF soldiers being able to take on that task.
No, to be honest, I was kind of pushing you just to sort of see kind of what you would say, and yeah, I think that the solution. I think that the answer is exactly how you said. Politically, one of the hardest parts about fighting counterinsurgency is watching your own sons and daughters die while trying to pave a road or set up a water supply for civilian population. And no one, especially after October 7th, has any patience for seeing an Israeli soldier dying while trying to help a Palestinian. It's one thing if an Israeli soldier dies while in battle with a Palestinian, militant, but to actually be killed while trying to help Palestinians is just, in the mindset of Israelis at this point in time, is a waste of a life. So yes, from a political and a cultural moment right now, Israelis are certainly not ready for that, and I understand that on both a logical and, if I'm being honest, on an emotional level as well. I think I would also find it difficult to turn on the TV and see an IED that went off next to a group of Israeli soldiers who were handing out aid to a bunch of Gazans. Just like it was difficult for me to see that as an American watching the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War on television as well, seeing American soldiers get killed doing the exact same thing. There is, when you have 100 years of ethnic hatred, the idea that you're suddenly going to switch to that kind of counterinsurgency it's a bit unreasonable. To bring it back to the mercenaries, look, I do want to push back against one thing you said, which is where I think, you and I are thinking of as Americans who also watched Iraq and Afghanistan, which is where Blackwater had multiple incidents of firing on civilians, and you got to think about the kind of guys who want to be mercenaries, right? These are guys who love the military so much. They love the violence and the fighting. They're like, oh, if only I can get paid 6 figures for doing this. Like, they don't care about the patriotism or any of that. They just want to fight and have fun doing it. These are the kind of guys who become mercenaries. They're cowboys. If you take a bunch of cowboys and you say, okay, I'm sure if you were to plant them in Ukraine and say, go fight the Russians, they would be incredible. But to say, hey, go distribute aid, that's not what these guys are here to do. These guys are here to kick in doors and punch skulls and shoot everything that's what these guys are. That's the reason they became mercenaries in the first place. If you take them and you say, hey, go distribute aid to a bunch of civilians, and oh, by the way, there's a bunch of militants running around there too who are dressed in civilian clothing, so watch out. These guys are going to drop and shoot, I think, at any opportunity they can, even if it's just for the fun of it. That's really what I believe, just kind of putting myself in the mindset of a mercenary. That said, I mean, look, I get the rock and the hard place that the Israelis are in, which is where politically and culturally they're not able to supply the aid themselves, and turning off the faucet just isn't really an option. Even if you're Israeli, you just don't care about the Palestinians. At the end of the day, they're still holding dozens of Israeli hostages, and they rely on that aid just as much as the Palestinians do. So the aid has to get there somehow. But yeah, to be honest, I'm much more against this mercenary idea. Just because at the end of the day, for me, it just doesn't create a lasting peace. Like, at the end of the day, it's a Band-Aid. I think you even said it yourself, it's a Band-Aid. And I'm not for a Band-Aid situation. I think you have to do things like, when I see the PA in the West Bank, that gives me hope. that gives me hope that these Palestinians can govern their own streets if the motivation is there, they can take care of business. I would like to see that extended throughout all Palestinian or claimed Palestinian lands, Gaza and the West Bank. Whether or not, I think it comes down to a question of motivation when we're looking at Mahmoud Abbas and trying to figure out what his motivations are, whether or not he's trying to show the world that he can handle Gaza, or if he's just terrified for his life, and just a bunch of elements have kind of come together to force him to move. It's kind of like looking at a black box. Who knows?
Yeah.
But that's my kind of take on the mercenary question.
Well, at the end of the day, I think that the final answer here kind of rests somewhere in between, where even if you look at the situation in the West Bank, where there is a certain degree of hope that we feel when we see Abbas going after militants in the West Bank, we do have to put that in the greater context that Abbas is going after these militants in the West Bank, knowing that he is operating alongside the Israeli army, which nobody likes to really talk about this in Ramallah, but is known to everyone, very much cooperates with the PA and works with the PA on ensuring that Abbas will continue to stay in power for an indefinite period of time in the West Bank. So, this entire framework of hope that we're feeling in the West Bank of Abbas reasserting his authority is really only taking place within the framework of Israeli military occupation of the West Bank. That's the only framework that allows this to develop in the way that it develops. It's not peace. It's the feeling that if I don't win this battle against Hamas militants, I know I can rely on those guys in the IDF that will, as much as I don't want to talk about this in public, that will have my back and help me fight against these jihadists if the shit hits the fan. And I think that's kind of what, if we could hope for some sort of long-term peace in Gaza, I think that's the best thing that we could also hope for in Gaza, some sort of solution where we mishmash some form of local self-rule with an ongoing Israeli military presence to ensure that at the end of the day, these militants can't come back to the fold the way that they have previously. I do want to take this conversation maybe to other parts of the new war that we spoke about at the beginning of this episode.
But before you do, I want to comment on what you said, because historically speaking, when you're talking about Abbas saying, "Hey, the Israelis got my back, and I'm just interested in staying in power, so just send them in," kind of thing. Historically speaking, you're absolutely right. That was the biggest frustration about the U.S. and the Israelis, which is where the Palestinians aren't doing the legwork to take control of Palestine. But that does seem to be changing. The signs are there that the Palestinians are taking their own internal security very seriously. Before the past week or so, the PA would not go into Jenin. One of the reasons that they did was because these jihadists from Jenin stole several PA military jeeps. I believe it was a military jeep and an ambulance, actually. Filming themselves, riding around and shooting guns in the air, kind of as like a sign of humiliation to the PA. And the PA took that very seriously. And according to leak reports, and take all this with a grain of salt, is that when Abbas brought his head of security together, there were many who were very against what he wanted to do. And he basically threatened to fire them on the spot if they didn't take their soldiers and go into Jenin and essentially reestablish the PA's authority and sense of honor, really, as an organization in the West Bank. They did not do what they normally do, which is call the Israelis and point them in the right direction. They went in and did it themselves. That said, after how many years has it been? 9, 10 years almost at this point, of the PA just relying on the Israeli military to do all the dirty work for them. The PA is severely underfunded, severely undertrained, under manpower, underarmed. This is not an overnight solution. If they really want to be the dominant force in the region that they're governing, it's going to take a major, I think, reform of their security.
No, for sure. But again, I think the question here, and we don't have a way of answering this question, but the theoretical question before us is whether the PA would do what it did in Jenin over the past couple of weeks had Israel not maintained its ongoing military presence in the West Bank. If we were in a situation, for example, where a Palestinian state were established in the West Bank and the PA was the sole body responsible for Jenin, would it feel that it had the necessary self-confidence to go out and launch an offensive against jihadists in the northern West Bank? And I argue that it would probably crumble, just as we saw Assad crumble in Syria, because these are organizations that do not have the legitimacy of their own people and do not have the fighting capability to sustain these long-term fightings. These long-term military operations. The only thing, and this is kind of my main point here when I talk about the PA in the West Bank, the only thing that is sustaining this entire framework, the only glue that's keeping it together, is IDF soldiers fighting in the West Bank, giving the PA the sense of security that it can even go out on its own independent operations without the IDF, knowing that if they fail, if shit hits the fan, they have that backup option. And that is
fine, but
right.
and I honestly, I don't disagree with anything you said, but what we've seen in the past couple weeks is a change of attitude. Because up until now, you're absolutely right. The PA would not go in and reassert its control and probably would crumble. In fact, to say that the PA controls Jenin is a bit of a joke. It does not control Jenin. Jenin is controlled by militants. But the fact is that the PA is no longer interested in sending in the Israelis or allowing these militants to control this region. They now are going in and asserting their own control and dominance. I think that's something that deserves credit.
But again, the question is, would the PA
would they do if the
want to
Israelis weren't there?
Had they were the only power able to carry out this action.
I mean, look, up until this point, they haven't gone in and done that. So my answer to you would be probably not. But the fact is that now that they're actually doing it, and by the way, Palestinians are, PA soldiers and security forces are dying trying to take back Jenin. Like, they are sacrificing in order to get back that camp. Would they do it knowing with the Israelis just pulled out entirely and we're like, okay, we're out of this fight altogether? I think at the end of the day, this could be the beginning of a strong allyship in the sense that the Israelis are there. Just, you know what, you can even extrapolate it. Would the Israelis feel comfortable going into Lebanon if the Americans pulled out entirely? Probably not. We rely on the Americans the same way the PA relies on us. Like, at the end of the day, just because you have these allies who are willing to support you, should you fall, doesn't mean that you are incapable or unmotivated of carrying out these acts. The fact is that we're now seeing a motivated PA willing to do these things. I think that's a huge step in the right direction.
I agree with you. But that being said, when we talk about this long-term vision of peace in the Middle East and optimism about the future, the notion of this optimism is that each country kind of takes care of their own business and works in mutual cooperation with us on the many security and economic issues that are on the horizon. What's happening in the West Bank is a little bit different, yeah? Like at the end of the day, it is cooperation with the PA, but it's not taking place within the framework of, two independent countries that are helping one another. It's taking place in the framework of Israel, the strong power, very much dominating militarily the entire territory of the West Bank and allowing this small power of the PA to be involved here or there. And I'm actually, this entire roundup that I'm saying is typically said from a left-wing standpoint, where typically left-wingers kind of bring up this Israel's ongoing military presence in the West Bank as being some sort of proof of Israel's uninterest or lack of interest in a long-term solution for the Palestinian question. I kind of bring this up actually maybe from a little bit more of a right-wing perspective, where I'm kind of saying, because of this clear situation in the West Bank where, from a security perspective, the PA does not know how to function on its own as an independent operating authority in the West Bank. This is not, in my opinion, parallel to U.S.-Israel relations in the Middle East. This is a relationship of de facto, putting aside everyone's opinion on whether or not Israel is, the legitimate party responsible for the West Bank or not. It is de facto in practice a relationship of military occupier and occupied. And I'm coming at this not from the more left-wing perspective that typically talks about military occupation, occupier, and occupied. I'm actually coming at this from a right-wing perspective, saying that I don't see any other practical way for the West Bank to provide security for itself in the long term. When I say for itself, I'm referring to the PA providing that security in the long term, without the ongoing military occupation of the West Bank by Israel, which does kind of throw some shade to a certain degree on the optimism that we're feeling about the PA and the West Bank.
Let's get one thing straight. The PA, up until now, and even including now, has absolutely failed on their mandate of governing the West Bank. They've absolutely failed from a security perspective, an economic perspective, and I would argue a civil perspective as well. Let's just get that absolutely crystal clear. I totally agree on that sense. I also would push back and say that it is absolutely, that first of all, on the one hand, it is absolutely in the interest of many of Israel's leading political parties, and having been leading political parties for the last decade and a half, to maintain Israel military occupation in the West Bank. I think many Israelis are very happy to see that. And you know what? I'm not even going to make this an Israeli left versus right situation. Israelis don't trust the Palestinians. I think if you look at any kind of recent polling by the Israeli Democratic Institute, which has pretty reliable polling for how Israelis generally feel, they recently released a poll that showed something like 90% of Israelis are convinced that the Palestinians are trying to massacre all of them, or all of us. So this idea of, well, we're going to secede from Yehuda Shomron, which is biblically was the former capital of Judea and of Samaria, the ancient biblical Jewish homelands. That we're not only going to secede from these cultural points, that offends us on a cultural level, but from just a practical military perspective, that you are going to secede these elevated positions overlooking Tel Aviv and Gush Dan and Ben Gurion Airport to a bunch of people who want to just cause a second Holocaust is not going to happen. So you have on both sides kind of the Palestinians who have absolutely failed in their mission, and who the leading PA is just really only interested in padding their bank accounts and really staying in power. And an Israeli presence for whom they're okay with that as well, because it just gives them more legitimacy to be there. That being said, at least publicly facing, the Israelis and Americans have been pressuring the Palestinians, or the PA, for the last decade and a half to really take control over their own territory. Say, hey, if you want to become a state, you got to show us that you can be a state. And look, when you mention sort of how everybody's acting these kind of like independent actor kind of ways as autonomous nations, I think that that's a very Western way of looking at it, to be honest. This idea that a nation has to be autonomous in order to be able to defend its own internal secure borders and this and that. It's very much like, it's a Western style of looking at how a nation should be run. But let's take into account the fact that we're not existing alongside people whose ancestors went through the Enlightenment, and for who didn't go through World War I and II, and who the idea of a nation state is still a very foreign kind of concept, or not. It's not necessarily foreign, but it's not a homegrown grassroots concept. Something that was imposed on them, and how they want to operate a nation state is completely up to them. I would say that having a Palestinian Authority that can finally actually carry out security measures, maybe the next generation, I would say, satisfy the Israelis to the point of like, okay, we're working next to a partner who we can cooperate with and who can handle security inside its own borders. But two, that we will essentially be there, like you said, absolutely right. If they fail to curb jihadists wherever they might happen to be, we can come in there and help them. Absolutely. Why not? And in that sense, I would say it's very similar to the Israeli-American relationship. At this point, is the Palestinian-Israeli relationship similar to how the Israelis and Americans do business? No, not really. We don't have American soldiers fighting next to us inside of Gaza, but we rely very heavily on American logistical support and American weaponry and American planes, which was, we kind of mentioned at the beginning of the episode, is how Israel has very much been strategizing and thinking of how its long-term global reach, or at least regional reach, relying on American Air Force power. So there Is it an apples to apples situation? No, but the beats are there.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I think that the question is how do we define hope? What is a hopeful vision of the future for the Middle East look like? And if I take it back to what you were saying earlier, that you want to see stable solutions for the Middle East, I think the only way to bring about those stable solutions, as much as and it might not be within our ideal vision, is with Israel playing the active role as regional patron of parties that it's working with. We can call them proxies, if I'm going to tie it back to the earlier part of the episode. The PA might be considered a co-epiter style proxy that Israel is working with to one degree or another.
It's actually very interesting to consider them like that.
And definitely the Palestinian people considers the PA a proxy of Israel and of the United States. Whether or not that's actually the case is a separate topic of discussion, but that is the perception. The perception is that they are Palestinian contractors of Washington and Jerusalem. I think that this is I'm not saying this from a critical perspective, by the way. I'm not criticizing this new war that we're fighting in the Middle East. I'm describing the way at least that I see it playing out on the ground. This new war is one where Israel is seeing the initial 5 theaters of battle slowly coming to a close. It is working with partners in many of these former theaters of battle to bring about some degree of change, even if it's not allies in a public way. It's some degree of patron-proxy relationship, even in the West Bank, be it with certain partners that Israel has in Syria, be it perhaps relationships that Israel is developing with certain local groups in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. And maybe even Iran, as you stated earlier, with Israel's potential relationship with ethnic groups in the country. I do want to maybe, as we bring this episode to a gradual close, to take this conversation to one about the future, where, we're talking about this new war that Israel is fighting. 5 theaters of battle coming to a gradual close, and 2 theaters coming back much stronger. I see 2 possible avenues for Israel to go down, and I would love to hear your take on this as well. I think avenue number 1 is these 5 theaters of war actually go down to some sort of full close, and Israel manages to create some sense of stability in Lebanon, in Gaza, in other theaters of battle, maybe even creating a peace agreement with Syria and elsewhere, as it goes on to shift its center of gravity of fighting to Iran and to Yemen. That's avenue number 1. Avenue number 2 is, or I should say maybe scenario number 2, is that all of what we're seeing in recent weeks is just a fog being thrown up to confuse us, the asses that are the masses that don't know any better. And what we're ultimately seeing is a slow pullback from what we had before us over the past year and even prior. That's going to come back at some point. The fighting is going to come back at some point in a very significant way with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Hamas in Gaza. We're not going to see any sort of peace with the current or former jihadists, depending how we look at it, with the new Syrian regime in Damascus, and elsewhere. We're not going to reach this long-term peace that we're hoping for. What do you think?
I mean, it's a good question. Look, if we are having the wool pulled over our eyes, like you mentioned in scenario 2, then there's no way for me to know that. In terms of seeing the winding down of 5 theaters, look, I mentioned it, I think, a year ago, which was, I to use the old World War II analogy, if you were to go back in time to speak with someone living in, let's say, London in November of 1941, imagine how that Londoner is seeing the world, right? The Japanese have taken the Philippines. They're bombing Australia. The Londoners themselves are getting bombed by the Nazis, who have, at this point, pacified all of Europe. and are 30 kilometers outside of Moscow. If you were to then tell that individual, hey, you guys are going to win the war, they might laugh in your face, call you an idiot. And then you fast forward to August 1945, and suddenly Japan has been decimated by 2 nuclear bombs. Germany is getting carved up into 4 slices by the victorious Allies. Anything can change in war, and it can change in unexpected ways, in ways that no one is planning. And just like over the summer or a year ago, where we really felt, at our lowest, right now we're feeling pretty good. Where we're mentioned, as you mentioned, the 5 theaters seem to be kind of winding down, and now we're focused on the Yemenis, who they certainly have missile capabilities, but they don't pose an existential threat in the way that some of these other organizations along our border did. The Iranians themselves are, as you mentioned, I think probably the weakest they've been since the Iran-Iraq War. It feels like a good time to be an Israeli at this point, but things can change.
Yeah.
Things can change very quickly. I try and approach these situations with cautious optimism. I want to believe that we're rapidly approaching a ceasefire. I want to believe we're rapidly approaching it to a reshuffling of the Middle East with a much weaker Iran, with a much stronger Israeli-Sunni alliance. When I say Sunni, I mean Gulf state Sunni alliance that can really bring about fundamental change to the Middle East. But I feel that optimism might be a little too much, to be honest.
Yeah.
Even saying it out loud, it seems a little too much.
I agree with you. I think that much of the characteristics of the old war are going to manifest themselves again in some constellation or another in the coming months, even if we see some sort of short-term stop in the fighting. I think that Hamas in Gaza, we might get a deal to release the hostages and have a temporary ceasefire. I don't see this coming to some sort of long-term solution in the Gaza Strip. I think that the way it looks now, at least, fighting is an inevitable probability in the Gaza Strip. Lebanon, I'm also pessimistic. Even though the ceasefire is holding, we saw that very shortly after the ceasefire that there was already rockets being shot from Lebanon at Israeli targets, and Israel is continuing to carry out strikes in South Lebanon despite the quote-unquote ceasefire that is on right now. I don't see this holding for the long term. I do think that some sort of return to fighting is going to happen. So I'm also pessimistic there. I think the only theater of battle that I'm somewhat optimistic on is Syria. I do believe that there is a real opportunity to bring about some sort of long-term partnership with the Syrians. I think that it remains to be seen whether or not that partnership will be a full-on peace agreement with the new regime, but I don't think it's out of the question, at least at minimum, to expect some sort of unofficial friendly relationship between Jerusalem and Damascus, styled Israeli-Jordanian relations in the 1980s before the peace agreement was signed in the 90s. I think that's the one area or one aspect of the old war where I am optimistic about some sort of change being brought about in the Middle East.
Look, at the end of the day, Israel has long feared Iran, the General Soleimani's Ring of Fire. The idea that with these various Iranian proxy groups, that they could surround Israel and eventually just hammer it out of existence. Sinwar set off a chain reaction after October 7th that has resulted in a systematic dismantling of this Ring of Fire. Does that mean the Iranians are down for the count? Absolutely not. I'm sure they'll devise some other plan or recruit new proxies or whatever might happen to be, rearm their old groups. But at least for the moment, the fighting has resulted in some tremendous Israeli victories, at least at this particular point in time, which does cause reason to be hopeful and does cause reason to I think, celebrate. And me personally, I think that the Israelis need to capitalize on this victory and really deliver to the Iranians a very serious blow. I'm, of course, speaking about strikes on nuclear sites. I'm I truly believe that the Israelis have a golden opportunity right now to do it, even if they have to act independently. I don't know if the Israelis are capable of independently doing it. I don't know if they need the Americans to make this operation happen, or if they are able to do something like this by themselves. But there's never been a better time.
Right.
And if I were the Iranians, just from their perspective, and I'm looking around and seeing all my allies being systematically handicapped, I might say, well, the only way for me to reassert deterrence is to begin a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, which is, I think, the last thing that this region needs.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the Israelis have this golden opportunity, and I do hope that they take it, because we've seen a lot of times where Bibi has been overly cautious, and I wish that the Gantz-led left would really step up and take this moment to call Bibi on his weakness and call Bibi on his cowardice, and to really reassert themselves back in the Israeli public, because right now the Gantz parties and them are just so embarrassingly irrelevant that they every time they really have a moment to assert themselves on the Israeli political stage, they wither up and die, and they need to attack Bibi where he's weak. I'm tired of this corrupt Israeli right-wing weak government that can't get itself together. But there's really no other option at this point.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but there's not. And if we really want to see any kind of fundamental change, it also has to begin internally. It has to begin with us. And unfortunately, we just have politicians who are, with the exception of Bibi, who is fantastic at his job for the most part, besides being the weakest he's ever been in his entire career, everybody else is just awful.
It's just awful.
They're just awful at their jobs.
If until now we spoke about the seven fronts of war, the Israeli domestic home front is
probably the eighth.
The eighth front of battle.
Yeah, and really the one that I would say at this point in time matters the most.
Yeah.
And I think we'll maybe save a discussion for the internal home front, maybe for next episode.
Yeah, maybe we'll save it for episode 4.
Yes, sir. All right. Thank you everybody for listening. We'll speak to you all very soon.